Well, I'm Richard Jessor. I'm called Dick Jessor by most people. And I grew up in Brooklyn. I was born in Brooklyn, born in 1924. So I recently hit the magic number of 100. Grew up there during the Depression. And when I was about 8 years old, we were in the midst of the Depression. My father had an opportunity for us to live free on a farm in Pennsylvania if indeed we would just take care of it. So we moved to a farm in Pennsylvania, and I went to a one-room country schoolhouse for my elementary schooling. I graduated from that one-room country schoolhouse and had a year or two at Quakertown High School. And then my parents were concerned that I couldn't get a really good education because it was Pennsylvania, farm country, not New York City, up to date and so on. So we moved back to Manhattan, and I enrolled in George Washington High School, and they found that I was actually ahead of my grade and skipped me when I enrolled, which was exactly the opposite of what my parents had been worried about. And so I graduated from that high school and then enrolled in City College. It was not City University then, because that was the only higher education my family could afford. And meantime, I had to have a job, and so I worked as behind the bar at the Roseland Ballroom at the time, which was a good education for me, but not an academic education. And so I was at City University in 1942 and decided that I wanted to enroll in the military.
What was your awareness of global events leading up to World War II?
We're a Jewish family, and I had a sense of, from parents talking and so on about what was going on in Germany, never at that time had a full appreciation of what I came to see not too long ago visiting one of the concentration camps in Europe, but that's a whole other story. So I decided, since my father was not only working on the farm, but was bringing in an income during the Depression by being in the Merchant Marine, and he was sailing to South America on trips and was away from home a lot. So I decided when I wanted to enroll in the military that I'd enroll in the Navy. Went down to around Wall Street where the recruiting offices were, and came up to the door of the Navy office, and it was closed. And right next door was the Marine Corps office, and it was open. That's how I got into the Marines, not having the slightest idea what they were about.
What was your parents' reaction, your family's reaction, when they found out that you had enlisted in the Marine Corps?
Well, they didn't have any more idea about it than I did. I mean, they just thought it was another military thing. Had no real sense of the Marine Corps. And I think it was really World War II that taught a larger part of the population what the different militaries were, and particularly what the Marines were. And I think the Suribachi flag really had a huge impact, a pervasive impact on people's awareness of what the Marines stood for.
Can you talk a little bit about your basic training experience and then your transition as a Marine?
Yeah. Well, since I enrolled from a university, they figured I should be in officer training. So they sent me to Yale, which being from a poor family, the idea of being a student at Yale. So they sent me to Yale, and I was there about a year and a half or two. And mainly I was studying things like map reading and so on that would be helpful in the military. And when my time was up there, I was sent to Paris Island and was in boot camp, and it was pretty rough. And after a while, they decided I was not officer candidate training. I didn't make some of those 20-mile trips with no water allowed and so on. So I was then sent to San Diego, a long train trip across country. And from San Diego, we shipped out to Maui. And so all of my real training took place on Maui. And it was from Maui that we went to Iwo. So on Maui, we did a lot of practice landings from off the island. And then we boarded ship, were sent over to Honolulu, and from there really boarded the big troop ship. Well, part of the issue was that we didn't know where we were going, and we couldn't tell our parents where we were going. So what we did is we looked at a map of the Pacific, and we named the various islands with names like Aunt Mary and so on, and shared that with my parents. And so actually, once I did know that we were going to Iwo Jima, I could say we are going to visit Aunt Mary, and then they would know. So we trained on Maui and then shipped over to Honolulu, to Pearl Harbor. And it was from Pearl Harbor that we boarded the big troop ships that were going to take us into the Northeast. That trip was not really a very pleasant one. We were stacked about 4 high, but on just canvas, no mattresses, nothing. And so not able to remember whether it was at Guam or at Saipan that we transferred to landing ship tanks, LSTs, and set out from there for Iwo Jima. And I still remember that we were off the island, standing off the island, and were called up on deck by one of the commanders who gave us a little talk and then said, by tomorrow night, I want you to know a lot of you are going to be dead. That was the Marines' idea of how to be tough. It's very different now. But so our thinking about the landing at that time, we had no real understanding of what combat was. But we were there and we were watching the bombardment of the island. It was coming from ships, cruisers and destroyers offshore, just shelling the island. And it was coming from flyover bombers. And you could watch that and think nobody could survive that. There wasn't the understanding of the underground nature of the Iwo Jima defenders. So we all sort of had a sense there that maybe this will go okay. And we were told that the plan was to take Iwo Jima in 3 or 4 days and reboard the LSTs and go on to Japan for the invasion. That was our understanding. And of course, instead of 3 or 4 days, it took 36. So I just remember we went over the side of the ship, and meanwhile the amphibious tractors had come out of the bowels of the ship and had been circling around, and as they came up to the side, we'd go on to the ropes over the side, drop into the amphibious tractor, and it would take off and circle, and ultimately we were arranged in waves, and so I was in the 4th troop wave. So the Japanese had all of their artillery in the caves during the bombardment, and then the ships had to lift the bombardment to allow the first waves in. So the first waves got in, as I remember, without much fire on them, without much artillery. But I was in the 4th troop wave, so it was about 9:20 in the morning when we hit the beach. By that time, the artillery had come out of the Japanese caves, and they had every inch of the beaches bracketed in their sights. And so I just remember everything was exploding all around when we hit the beach. So the first couple of waves got in pretty well, but when the 4th troop hit the beach, by then the Japanese had their stuff out, and there was no bombardment. So what I remember is the Amtrak hit the beach and couldn't get up the grade. So we're stuck at the water's edge. So we jumped out the back of the amphibious tractor, ran around in the water, and I remember just hitting the beach, and I mean hitting it because everything was exploding. And I looked over to my left, and there was a Marine lying on his back, and a large bubble of blood coming out of his mouth. And I just was transfixed, and as I watched him, he died. And that was my introduction to combat. And so from then, our mission was, amphibious tractors were supposed to take us up to the larger of the airstrips. So after we were on the beach, what we did was when there was a lull, we'd get up and run and fall into a bomb crater and hang out there until there's a lull, get up and run another. While we was there, in one crater, a shell hit the rim of and one of the guy's abdomen was torn open, and there was stuff flying on everybody. And so it was sort of an amazing introduction to war, but we kept going, bomb crater to bomb craters, gaining some ground toward the airstrip, but never getting really close to it on that first day. And then it got dark, and so we just huddled in the crater we were in. And that's the next day. It began a process of being under artillery fire almost constantly, and just running, dropping into a crater, trying to get up to the airstrip. And after 3 days on the front line, we were pulled back for a day of rest, and we were told we could write a letter home. And so I wrote to my parents, and I said goodbye, and I thanked them for everything they'd done for me. And I said, doubtful I'll get off this island alive. And that was my feeling. I felt then, for those days from the landing until the flag on Suribachi, that I wasn't going to live. He just, so anyway.
Let me ask you, Dick, was that generally the feeling amongst all of your fellow Marines as well?
Yeah, we were just surrounded by carnage, and you could be in a particular place and the guy next to you, and he'd get hit, and you didn't. And, you know, it all turned out to be luck, actually, and that was it. So,
can you talk a little bit about how you were wounded?
On the first day, I, again, was huddled in a bomb crater, and a shell went off, and it was a piece of shrapnel that was spent and hit me in the back. But by the end of the day, a corpsman was able to take it out, and it wasn't deep. But it was my baptism is the way I think of it.
I've always heard that Marines protected their corpsmen.
They were amazing. Here we would be huddled down, and they would run from crater to crater. Anybody hurt, anybody hurt. So it felt like that after I'd written that letter. I think it was on the third day. My mother kept that letter, by the way, till she died, but it's disappeared. So
how traumatizing for them to read that from you, right?
Yeah, but also they were listening to radio at the time, and there was a guy named Gabriel Heater. I don't know if you remember. And my mother told me this. He, whatever night it was on those early days, broadcast, he said, if you know anyone who has a son on Iwo Jima, go to them tonight and comfort them, because so many of them are being killed or wounded. And so the fact that the battle was bloody was getting back to the American people.
After you were wounded, how difficult was it for you to continue pushing forward and continue doing your mission?
There was no alternative. That was part of what the Marines did to you. They got you so that you had a mission and you had to do it. And of course, for us, it was the only meaningful thing you could do was to get up out of that crater and run, because if you stayed there, you're gonna have another bomb hit the rim. So you'd get up and run, and each time you'd gain some ground uphill. But I just knew that I was going to get killed at any moment. And so it was only on the 23rd, it was the 5th day in. I was on the front line, and we turned north after we hit the beach. We turned north. Suribachi was behind us, and we were getting fired from Suribachi and fire from in front. And so I happened to turn around, and I saw this flag flying. It's strange, but I still find it hard to talk about it. But I saw that, and I started screaming, the flag is up, the flag is up. And so all the guys around in the line started, turned around and looked. And that moment was transformative for me. I began to think, well, maybe we can make it. And so my whole attitude changed from, I'm gonna die any minute, to, well, we have a mission and maybe we can make it. Now our rear is covered, and it's just what's in front of us.
It had the same effect on your fellow Marines and your friends?
We were animated by that. It was, it's hard to convey, but we were taking fire from Suribachi and from the rear, and we hadn't won anything. I hadn't seen a Japanese enemy alive. I'd seen corpses, but not. And so we never had a sense that we were moving to victory. And so it was only when the flag was unfurled up there that we began to get a sense, well, maybe we will win this battle.
What was the nature of combat on Iwo for you and for your fellow Marines?
I was in Headquarters Company, 1st Battalion, 25th Regiment, 4th Marine Division. So I was in Headquarters Company, so I was on the front lines making maps for where we're getting fire from, and then sharing them with the platoon commander, and then it would go all the way down to the beach. And so whenever we could identify a blockhouse or a cave opening. And so that would lead then to, they'd bring their flamethrowers to the mouth of a cave and just blow them in there. Nobody could survive that. But
how did the enemy's tactics, their use of these tunnels and the use of these caves and bunkers impact your unit specifically?
we were under fire from them constantly. And once we could identify where it was coming from, then we would try to disable it, either with flamethrowers or with direct fire. But I want to make a point about the fact that we were frustrated a lot of the time, just feeling like we can't see the enemy. They're not out there, I mean, visible to us. And so we were being battered and didn't fire back whenever we saw fire was coming, but we didn't until one day a Japanese soldier was captured alive, and I was told to take him back to the beach. And so, I have my rifle and I'm pointing at him and I'm saying, making gestures, and he was very accommodating and would walk, and I had my M1 trained on him, and I had to take him back through our lines. And I wasn't really prepared for it, but I think I might have had a sense. But at one point, one of the Marines jumped up and came running at us and shouting, "I'm going to kill that son of a bitch." So I pointed my rifle at him and said, "I have orders to shoot anybody who touches my prisoner." And he stood there and looked at me, and I had the rifle pointed at his head, and he backed off. That happened one more time before I got to the beach with another case. But I think I've said many times that I've ruminated over that situation, because I think that if the Marine had made a move toward us, I probably would have shot him. And it was the wrong thing to do. And so I thought a lot about, would I have shot him? And I think I would have, and that's not who I am. So.
Well, Dick, it's interesting to hear how you have reflected on your past experiences, and I think it's inevitable that you would do that. I know that in the past you've also talked about when you would encounter some of these Japanese prisoners, that you were struck in some ways by the similarities between you all.
I remember getting up from my foxhole one morning and seeing a dead Japanese nearby. And they had flags that had been inscribed with good luck things, and they had them wrapped around their waist. And so I thought I'd go over and see if he had a flag. And what I still remember is, as I bent over him to pull up his shirt, I saw that he had letters in his pocket. And I had what I refer to as this epiphany, because I had letters in my pocket from my parents. And I said, what are we doing here? He's just like me. That we share the same humanity. Why are we doing this? And it was a time for me to really make some long-range commitments. And in that situation, I said to myself, if I get out of this alive, I'll never go to war again. So that was one thing. And the other thing I said was, if I get out of this alive, I want to do something good for humanity. It's an overblown statement, but I just felt it was wrong to be doing this. And so, in any case, I went ahead, and he did have a flag under his shirt, and I took the flag, and I had it, and I have no idea how it disappeared, but I have pictures of it holding the flag. And so that was really important for me. And when opportunity came, when I was invited to the National World War II Museum to do an oral history, and went through a lot of this, I had never thought of it, but about a week after I left, I got a message from the head of the educational travel department of the museum saying, Dr. Jessor, are you free next March? I had no idea what that was about. I said, well, I guess so, why? And then he said, we have a trip going to Iwo Jima, and we'd like you and your wife to be part of it. And it was an airplane that had, I think, several hundred passengers on it, or committed to take the trip. And he said, and we can talk during the flight about some of your experience. And so I immediately felt that that was something I wanted to do. And mainly just thinking about the guys I was with who never got off the island alive, and that I would do, going back would be a way of honoring them. So that was one thing. And then when I learned about the trip having an honor ceremony on the landing beach with Japanese survivors of the Iwo battle, and we would meet and have a reunion of honor, that's what has all the meaning for me. I want to embrace these guys because they're just like me. And I want to show that we share humanity and we're the same. So the trip had the possible trip had a lot of meaning for me, and I still hope, but it would have to be next year, and I'm not making any long-range commitment. Apparently was an underwater volcano just off the beach, and the reports were a whole new little island was forming just off where we landed. That's just to show that it was a serious eruption. And so when I checked with them about this year's trip in March, whether the cancellation was because it was still active and the Japanese were refusing to allow visitors or not, but the answer I got is, well, we know that Iwo is off the tour. It's called the Victory in the Pacific Tour. That Iwo is off the tour, but we're not sure why. And it may be just the uncertainty of whether it would start firing up.
So looking back, Dick, how do you process this? And it's been 80 years since the battle. How do you process that intensity, the brutality of the battle? And I'm also cognizant of the fact that now we have this term called post-traumatic stress. Back then there was really no term for it aside from being shell-shocked. But how did you personally process that?
We were so destroyed then that it was a matter of going back. We had abandoned our training camp on Maui. It was then, and we're supposed to go into Japan, leapfrogging from Iwo. So we got back to Maui and began training, landings and so on. But every night, someone would go down to the PX and get a case of beer. And it turned out we were living in tents that had 6 people in them. And it turned out that 5 of us were veterans, and 1 was a new recruit who had not experienced Iwo. So every night, we'd get this beer, and we would literally go over absolutely everything that happened on Iwo. And we did that night after night. And finally, this kid just blew up at us and said, I'm so tired of listening to this shit night after night. I've heard it over and over, and I can't stand it anymore. Why don't you guys knock it off? And apparently, and I'll tell you how I know, apparently I stood up and I said, nobody's gonna tell me that I can't speak my mind. I said, that's what we fought for. And I gave him a lecture. You know, I was a pedant even before I became a professor, I guess. Apparently, I gave him a lecture about why we fought and how freedom of speech was at the center of it. I know about this because one of the guys in the tent, Red Kelly, he was with me in almost every bomb crater, and he was already a corporal and a wonderful guy. He came home and became, in Boston, lived in Boston, came home and became a high school history teacher. So, sometime in the 1990s, I get a letter from Yale University saying, we've been contacted by a Mr. Red Kelly, who is looking for you, and he has asked us if Dick Jessor is alive or dead, or how can I contact him. And of course, we can't reveal that information, but he gave us his information and we can share that with you. So I called him. I said, Red, you know. And I said, what have you been doing? He said, I'm a high school teacher. He said, every student I've had since I started teaching has heard about Dick Jessor. I said, what do you mean? And he said, I tell them the story of this one night when you got up and gave this lecture to this kid. So it was, so we had good talk. And after I got back from Iwo and was discharged, I put the Marine Corps behind me. But I also knew that they were meeting every year. Our 4th Marine Division had their annual reunions. And so Red said to me, you haven't come to any of our reunions, but you've got to come to the next one. And out of talking with him, I said, okay, I'll go. And it was in St. Louis, and I went, and they were all proud of me. I had become a professor and so on. But what I saw there was that having been a Marine was the high point of their lives. They had symbols of Marine on their cars and on their garages, and they showed me pictures of this and talked about it, and had been to every annual meeting since the war ended, and I could see I wanted that behind me, but they wanted, it was so important. So it was a very different, and it was a poignant experience to go back and see what it could mean if you survived, to give meaning to your life in ways that perhaps was not being provided. When I began to talk about it, my kids were very critical about my not sharing with them. And so that's another story that I just wanted to put it behind me. I did have a feeling about having been in the Marine Corps that it had strengthened me, that having gotten through Iwo, I had a feeling I can get through anything. And so that was positive. But everything else was carnage and thinking about it. Jane and I were up in Aspen maybe 15 years ago, and it was raining, so we just, instead of hiking, we went to the movies, and it was Saving Private Ryan. And I still have trouble talking about it, but as I watched the landings, apparently I started crying, I started shaking, and Jane looked over at me, and you know, I trained as a psychologist, and I'm breaking down and thinking, Jesus, I didn't know I still had this in me, and I just couldn't stop crying. And it's just so clear that it had impacted me, and even though I hadn't talked about it after the war very much, that it was there. And I wasn't aware of it. I didn't have post-traumatic stress, partly because all that beer was cathartic as well as. So it was after that experience and just sobbing that I realized it had more meaning for me than I had uncovered. So I began talking about it in ways, and people then were interested, and of course my colleagues and so on, and so it's become part of my identity.
Dick, can you talk a little bit about some of your friends, comrades, Marines who stood out? Any stories in that regard?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I was a replacement in a unit that had done Saipan and Tinian, had actually been, I think, on Guam, but certainly on Saipan and Tinian prior to the Iwo. So they were experienced veterans, Marine veterans, and they just looked after me. I mean, I was a recruit, and so especially somebody like Red Kelly, somebody like whose name I still remember, James Galvin, they were veterans and they knew how to look after me. They had my back when we were under fire and say, no, don't go there, let's go here. And so they had a knowledge of surviving battle that I had no awareness of, and they tried to impart that to me, not in lecturing, but in taking care of me. And things like, no, don't go over there, there's that hill over there looks dangerous. It didn't totally change my life, but it made me think about what I wanted to do and what I wanted to become, and how I could make myself feel that I was doing something socially valuable. Having just to come out of that slaughter, I knew that I wanted to be a contributor in some way. And when I decided to become a professor, I felt I was on the track that I had been hoping to do. And I've had thousands of students, and I keep getting now. And some of them, since there's been a big deal about me and my Marine Corps history and the fact that I'm the longest serving, so they just named a building after me on the campus. And so some students contact me and say, I didn't know that you were in the Marines. That would have been important for me to know. But they said, well, your class meant a lot to me, even though I didn't know that about you. And
Well, it leads me to another question too. How did your wartime experience influence your work in psychology and human behavior?
Yeah, I had a sense that a lot of what I was being trained for as a psychologist was not really what it should be. It didn't understand things that I thought I understood better because I was exposed to what human beings can do to each other. And so it gave me a kind of caring about other people beyond just wanting to be a successful teacher. But when somebody wasn't making it in my class, I wanted to be helpful and not just say, well, you ought to study more. So I wanted to get them to understand the possibilities that lie ahead of them if they make use of them. And so if you ask my wife, she'll tell you I'm not the most sensitive person in the world. It made a difference for me.
What lessons from the war might you have incorporated into your research and also your teaching?
Well, my research has really, and my teaching, but my research has been about how young people growing up manage to get off track as they're moving into young adulthood. So my major developmental stage is working with adolescents and teaching. And so I've worked on the Southern Ute reservation down near Durango, and I've worked in the slums of Nairobi, and I've worked in rural villages along the Upper Nile, trying to make opportunities available for young girls in those villages who had no opportunities at all and were not the boys. When in those rural villages, an 8-year-old boy could command a young woman what to do. And so I've tried both in teaching about what's important and how to navigate this developmental stage, especially with limited resources when you live in a slum unlike anything you can think of in Kenya. And I think it's humanized what I do.
Yeah. You were instrumental in establishing the University of Colorado Boulder's Behavioral Sciences Department.
Yeah, it's the Institute of Behavioral Science.
How did that come about? What was your vision for it, and how does it evolve?
Well, it's interesting because when I got discharged from the Marines, I went right back to Yale to get a degree. And so even though the spring semester of 46 had been underway, the dean there was very accommodating because I was a veteran, and he said, well, you can make it up. And so I got my BA from Yale, and then spent a year at Columbia and got a master's degree, and then got my PhD at Ohio State. So when I was trained at Yale, it was a time in which I think the psychology was all wrong. It was the height of behaviorism, and behaviorism was really influenced by Pavlovian conditioning, and it had no sense of the human being and the interior life. It was all about external behaviors and movements, and largely predicated on rats. And so I found that very disappointing. So when I got here, and that's partly why I went into clinical, because I thought that would be able to work at a different level than what I was being critical of. But when I got here, I found that some of my colleagues had the same feelings about what I was describing as disappointing. And so we began to talk together. And what we realized is the university is organized in departments. So somebody becomes an economist, somebody becomes a geographer. But the world's problems, whether it's poverty or population or the environment, can't be dealt with by an economist you need to bring those people together because the problems are so intensely collaborative requirement. And so we began meeting. There was a group of 5 or 6 of us, faculty, and we had meetings every 2 weeks or so and trying to find out, well, how can we build something that's not where we're in these silos in our department? And so by that time, there had been one institute on the campus. It's an environmentally organized institute. And so we began to think of an institute which is a place where people from multiple disciplines come together. And then you can, if you're thinking about poverty, you can think about geography and economics and political science together. And so another colleague and I have decided we wanted to establish an institute of behavioral science. And that was a new term also in the disciplines, but for us it meant we wanted to understand human behavior. So I was designated with my colleague to go to the president of the university who lived then on the campus. And so we go to his place, his residence, now the Alumni Center. And I'm told when we come in the door, the secretary sitting there says, the president is ill in bed, but he said he wants to see you. So you see the stairs over there. Just go up and go along the corridor and you'll find his room. He's in bed. So we go up, find the room, go in, and he looks up from his bed and he says, "What do you boys want?" So we told him, well, we want to do an institute. We want to bring things together. The departments are putting people separately. We want to put them together. And he said, "I like that idea. Go ahead and do it. I'll back you." So we had a lot of work to do, but it took us about a year, and then it went before the regents, and we got an Institute of Behavioral Science. That was 1957. I started this in 57. I came to Colorado in 51. Having that institute approved by the regents in 1957, and it was radical development. And now there are 12 institutes on the campus, but we were the second one. There are institutes and bringing all sorts of different disciplines together. So having done that at that time, we then applied for grants, and an anthropologist who was part of the group and I put in a grant and got a big grant from NIH. This guy, the anthropologist, had applied several times, had been rejected, and each time he was told he needed to get a psychologist who knew how to deal with statistics and so on. So we were in the same square dancing group, and so Homer asked me, "Would you be coming?" So I said, "Yeah, I'd be happy to be a consultant." So he put in the grant with me as a consultant. They came back and told him, "No, that's not good enough. He has to be a co-investigator." So I said, "Okay, I'll do that." And we got approved. We got a $300,000 grant in 1959, I think it was, which was large for the time. And that got us going.
Let me ask you, Dick, what would be your advice to young men and women, young scholars, students today, particularly those who study human behavior, and take that even a little bit further, human behavior maybe in extreme situations? Because certainly you endured the most extreme situations anybody could ever endure. What would be your advice?
That's a hard question because so much depends on not the knowledge that somebody has or the skills that they have, but on what they want to accomplish. And it's that sense of wanting to do something for humanity that animates then learning more about the statistics you need and learning more about the history of your discipline, which is really important. Learning about other disciplines, because we still have psychology departments and economics. There's a center at Stanford, the Center for behavioral science. And that was founded in those mid-50s, again, out of the same kinds of things that were animating us here. And so Jen and I were invited to spend a year there, and we did, and it was wonderful because we were spending it with people from all different disciplines, and we'd have seminars every day, actually, and learning about how people coming from economics see a problem is very helpful when you're coming at it from a different. So I would urge young scholars to get beyond the boundaries and limitations of being a department-defined scholar and becoming what we hope would be a behavioral scientist, that is, someone who is trying to understand human behavior. And that requires what psychologists were not doing, and especially those understanding the life context of people, because behavior doesn't come from inside, it comes from the interaction with what's going on outside, how much support do you have any models for your behavior, and so what are the opportunities, and understanding context is a major issue that psychologists have been remiss in trying to come to grips with.
Once a Marine, always a Marine, is that true? What advice would you have for young Marines today?
Well, the Marine Corps is different now. When I was in it, we would go on 20-mile hikes with full gear on, and water discipline meant no drinking the entire trip until you get back. Well, it was stupid. I mean, we know now that you get better performance if people are hydrated rather than. And so a lot of this has changed. And the idea that the commander would say, a lot of you guys are going to be dead tomorrow night, and turn on his heel and walk away. I mean, so the Marines are different. For me, as I commented before, I said it strengthened me. Mm-hmm. And the discipline, if it's well-meaning and not punitive, if it's well-meaning, is an asset in human development. It gives you a sense that you're in control of your life and what you're doing and where you're going. And so I'm all in favor of well-executed discipline for helping people to grow up in ways that help them take advantage of opportunities.
How would you like your own legacy to be remembered?
Well, you're touching on something that's very, I'm getting a lot of that now as I hit my 100th birthday, and I treasure when I hear from a student that I hadn't heard from for 20 years saying, your class was so important. And so I want to be seen as having been an important figure in a person's life and development. And if my teaching and mentoring has had that impact, that's important for me. But I want it to be more than at the individual level. I want it to be like the fact that I developed a theoretical framework that is being used across the globe now. When we go down, I can show you. Springer published a 3-volume set of my collected works. People can get on the web and find an article in one of the 3 volumes that they want and download it. Since those 3 volumes were published, there have been 60,000 downloads. So I go to bed at night and say, I may have my name on a building, but 60,000 people across the globe wanting to read one article of mine or another.
You were 20 years old when you landed on Iwo. If you could speak to your 20-year-old self who was preparing to land on Iwo Jima today, what would you say to him now?
You know, I would say that I didn't have a full sense of awareness of how unformed I was still at the age of 20. I thought I knew a good deal and so on, but to have a sense that the future is full of enhancements of your own development that you need at every stage of your life. And I talked to some of my friends who are all, everybody's younger than I am, but talked to some 80-year-old friends and try to get them to see that this is a whole new time of human development. From if you're 80 years old, you've got a lot of, and to make use of it, and to, instead of people decide when they're 70, it's time to quit, and they quit. And I'm very much committed to the idea that there is the continued possibility of development long after most people have quit.
What do you hope future generations will take away from your stories, your experiences?
Well, I think my life has shown that you can come from poor people. We lived on a farm trying to survive when I was, that there are opportunities that need to be grasped because they not only help to shape who you are, but provide opportunities for becoming something beyond what you are. And so I just want people to be more agentic about what they're doing with their lives. And I know that's, easy to say for middle-class people who have a lot of resources. It's not for the people that I spent a lot of my research on, but even for them, it's important advice. And one of our dearest colleagues grew up in Nairobi, Kenya, and I talked about the slums there. But he's turned out to be a professor, and so it's really being prepared to seize opportunities that make a life interesting as well as worthwhile.
Well, you've had such a fascinating life, and behind you, you have pictures with Mount Everest in Ecuador, and you've run, counting 8 New York City marathons. So that tells me you're still a New Yorker at heart, but you're also an adventurer. Can you talk about what has inspired you to do these things? As you said, kind of later in life.
Yeah. Well, I actually ascribe part of that to being a Marine. It was an experience that made you understand that even in the most restricted circumstances, you can get over them, get beyond them. You can do things that most people don't do because they haven't been trained as a Marine. And so I give that to the Marine experience, and it made me feel that it's worth taking risk if there's real payoff for you. And doing rock climbing is a lot of risk taking, and mountaineering, and I'm not sure I would have done that had I not been in the Marine Corps. So I value that. While I don't think the Marines had the proper psychology orientation, that's something that I feel, at least partly from them. And so I was doing a lot of, Boulder has an annual 10K here for the whole community, and so thousands of people go. And so I was doing every year doing the 10K. I did about 30 of them, I think. And so my daughter at one point said, "Dad, why don't you run a marathon?" And I said, well, maybe I should. And I thought about it, and then I decided to train for it and took the position I was going to do a marathon and put it in my CV, and then I'm done with it, so I could say I'm a marathoner. So I did it, and we're out for dinner in New York after the run, and my daughter says to me, "Dad, do you think I could do a marathon?" And I said, "Sure, if you train." And she said, "If I train, will you run with me?" So that was Marathon 2. And for Marathon 3, my son said, and so instead of putting 1 in my CV, I had 3 by the end of my... And so then it had become such a wonderful experience and so nourishing. So I figured I'll continue. So after 8, I actually stopped doing that because I got more interested in mountaineering, and it's a different kind of training. So I just...
Well, Dick, thank you. It's been just absolutely fascinating being with you, and it's extraordinary, and I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Great, I've enjoyed it very much, and as you can see, I'm touched sometimes talking about some of this stuff, but I sort of feel a responsibility to the future.
Kilimanjaro in Africa.
Here, Jane, tell me about your experience on Mount Kilimanjaro.
Oh, it was wonderful, exciting. I was teaching at Penn at the time in Philadelphia, and we met up at Dulles and went to Nairobi and then drove immediately to Tanzania and started climbing. So no acclimatization. And it was amazing to be walking through the changing flora in that area and to watch people, some of them going way too fast, so they didn't make it. Others, the guide saying, pole, pole, slowly, slowly. And so my goal was the 3rd night at Kibo Hut, coming from sea level, and it was an amazing experience. And Dick and my daughter continued up, and Dick got to the very tip, Uhuru Point. And our guide, who became our dear friend, when we came down, they said he, even then, 1996, was the oldest person they had climb Kilimanjaro. And they gave him Uhuru, a rhinoceros statue that's downstairs we can show you, as a memento. And that had belonged to Mary Leakey, the anthropologist who had been a friend of theirs. And when she died, her family gave Uhuru back to our guide and his wife, and they gave it to Dick. He started when he was 65 and did 8 in a row, and only stopped because he didn't have the time to train for both marathoning and high altitude mountain climbing.
I'm holding a vial of sand from the landing beach on Iwo Jima. This is from Blue Beach 1, which shows the black volcanic sand that our amphibious tractor got stuck in, and we had to jump out in the water and run around to get onto the beach. And this is a Japanese hand grenade that is disarmed. I guarantee that. And it used to have a string on the pull pin because their economy was in such bad shape they couldn't afford metal. So they had a string, and it's come off and rotted, so I need to put another one back. Iwo Jima. That's me here in the center, and that's Captain Westcott. And this is Sergeant Patterson, and this was a translator whose name I've forgotten.